We're going to be talking about the beliefs of religion and the attitudes of science. They're very different disciplines, but they're both trying to accomplish the same thing. They're both trying to figure out what's true and what's real. So there really can't be any disagreement between the two. Because if you're both looking for the truth, you got to come to the same conclusion. Because there's only one truth. But there's a different manner, a different attitude. For example, in Torah, what the Torah tells us is the final word. You either believe it or you don't. What science is trying to do is come to the conclusion through experiment, through research, and through logic. That can't be the final word, because as soon as you say this is the final word, you're not being logical anymore. You're being dogmatic. And that only applies to religion. We don't want to turn science into a religion. So the scientist, the good scientist, knows that no matter what argument I have today, tomorrow I'll have a better one. Science is always improving and growing. So you can't say, yesterday I discovered something and that's it. That's the final word. That's the fact. No, it's all part of the research. If you say this is it, this is the final conclusion, then you've killed science. There's no point in going and doing any more research if you're so sure you know the answer. So, science is human beings trying to figure out what the world is all about. The Torah is the Creator telling you what the world is all about. Let me give you a good example. You walk into a room and there's a desk sitting in the middle of the room. Now you're trying to figure out, how did the desk get there? Was it always there? Was it built, put together, right there in that room from pieces? You have all sorts of theories, possibilities of how the desk got there. And then some guy walks in and says, "Excuse me, this is my office. I bought the desk at Costco last week, Tuesday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon." Well, now you know, and you can put all your theories and guesswork away, because here's the guy who did it. So the Torah is telling you what God did when He created the world. It's not a theory. It's not research. It's not using human logic. It's giving you the final answer. Now the question is, can science, which means human beings, can human beings ever figure out what the Torah already tells us? Can we logically come to the same conclusion? Or are we going to go off in different directions? So now, let's discuss the whole thing. What does science actually say about the origins of the universe? Well, the scientists gave up on the origins. They don't talk about the origins of the universe anymore, because they just can't get there. So instead, we're talking about the age of the universe. We don't know how it started, but we think we know when it started. The theory is great. Maybe there was a Big Bang. Maybe there were some subatomic particles or some strange stuff that exploded into a world. Maybe. The theory still needs completing. There are still some holes in the theory. And at best, if there were no holes in the theory, it would be a perfect possibility. But nobody would say, this is for sure how it happened. Because you can't. You can't know for sure. You can only say it could have happened this way. And even if it could have happened this way, maybe it didn't. Maybe God came and created it and didn't wait for it to happen. So, there really is no conflict between a good theory and a fact. Yes?
I can't remember where I heard this. It was from a book, one of the many Jewish books. It was, God cast out a seed, and it exploded into the universe, word for word, what I just said.
Okay, is there a microphone you can speak into? I can hardly hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't remember where I heard this from. It was from one of the many books. Can't remember the name. Right? And it's God cast out a seed, and it exploded into the universe.
Like a Kabbalistic book?
What?
That was like a book on Kabbalah or something?
I believe so.
Yeah. Well, you see, the idea is the same, but the mystery remains. The mystery is, how do you go from nothing to something? And whether you're doing it scientifically or you're doing it religiously, it's the same question. Because we both agree, science and Torah agree, the world started at a certain point. It didn't always exist. So if it wasn't, how did it become? That's a mystery. And we gave up on figuring out how. We're just trying to understand when. So, on the question of how old the universe is, science is starting with a big assumption. If the world came into existence in an embryonic state, how long would it take for it to become the condition that it's in today? And they're probably right. It would take billions of years. But that's on the assumption that the world was once embryonic, that the world was born like a baby. Started off tiny, and then it matured, and then it grew. The Torah says God created the world complete, old, finished. There was never an embryonic world. Like, for example, when Adam and Eve were created, they were never fetuses. They were never babies. They were never in diapers. They were created 20 years old on the day that they were created. So they were created adults. Trees were created with fruit, not seeds. So if Adam and Eve chopped down a tree, how many rings would they find in that tree? Maybe hundreds. But the tree is only 3 days old. So the world was created mature. If it had been created embryonic and had to age over time, then yes, it would have taken billions of years. But it didn't happen that way. And it's very logical. God created the world because he wanted to see something happen. He didn't want to sit and wait billions of years for the world to get ready. So he created the world complete. He didn't create babies, he created adults who could do something useful. He created trees with fruit. He created an earth with diamonds, with gas, with oil, because he wanted a complete world and wouldn't wait for it to mature on its own. You know what the real issue is? The real issue is that the scientists don't want to deal with a certain question. And they're going to have to deal with this question. Because if you don't deal with this question, you'll never really understand this world as a scientist. The question is not how did the world come into existence, but why. So here's the logic. In the beginning, there was one thing, one absolute, self-sustaining, eternal being, whatever you want to call it, a subatomic particle. That was the one thing that existed at the beginning. And from that, everything else evolved. The real question is, why would anything evolve? There's only one thing that exists, and it always existed. Now what? Do you see the problem? So the scientists come up with a theory of a Big Bang. There were two things, and they collided, and that's what started the whole process. But you can't begin with two things. You got to start with one of the two. But if you start with one, it's the end of the story. There was one thing, and it always existed. And then what happened? It exploded? Why would it explode? It started to evolve? Why would it evolve? It's already perfect. You see, you have to ask why, not how. And that's why believing in God is the only thing that makes sense, because belief in God simply means whatever existed for real, whatever, maybe it was a subatomic particle, but it was a subatomic particle that wants something. And because it wants, it created. So what is God? What do we mean when we say God? We mean the original being, whatever that was, that wants something. So if you believe that there was a subatomic particle that wanted to evolve, well, that's God. You can call him subatomic if you want to, but basically that's God. So the only difference between science today and Torah is the question of the original being wants or the original being doesn't know. That's it. So we both believe in God. We both believe in an original substance. The question is only, the original substance knows what he's doing or doesn't know. That's it. So what makes more sense? That this original being evolved because it decided to, or the original being evolved for some unknown reason?
If it decided to, why would it decide to?
See, that's a very good question. But that's a logical question. Because of that question, I believe in the Torah. Because the Torah is basically that being telling us what he decided and why he decided to create the world. So what is the Torah? The Torah is the Creator telling us what he wants.
So
Which,
why does he want it?
why does he want it? I don't know. I don't know why I want what I want. There are certain things you want essentially. It's just important to you. Not for some other reason. He's not trying to use this to get to something else. This is what he wants. A world that starts off being ungodly and becomes godly.
Do you think it's possible at some point to figure out why he wanted, or will we never know?
You see, if you say why, that means that this is a tool, that he's using this to get to something else. Like, for example, you have a car. Why do you have a car? Because I like cars. Oh, is that the reason, or is it because you need to get downtown? If you need to get downtown and that's why you want a car, then you don't really want a car, you just want transportation. If you live downtown, you wouldn't need a car. So when God creates the world, it's not as a stepping stone to something else, which means it doesn't have a why. This is what he wants. If you say, why does he want it? It means he wants it for something else. He doesn't want it for something else. This is it. He likes this world. Not to get to heaven. Because he created heaven and then he created the earth. Which means heaven wasn't good enough. But trying to figure out what he wants and how important that is and how beautiful that is, that's a lot of wisdom. That's good information. And it's the opposite of sitting around trying to think like, who needs this? Who cares? So what? What's so important about cleaning up the planet? Who needs a planet anyway? So, if the world was created with a reason, it gives the world an importance. If it was created without a reason, so what's so terrible if it stops existing? Why fight for it? Why protect it? That make sense?
From our perspective, yes, but why would God care if God could so easily create another one?
That's a good question that we'll probably never know.
So there are questions that the Torah, as from what we, so the Torah is effectively set in stone. So if we know there are some things that we'll never know about Torah, but with science, there are things that we know we don't know, but that we could know. Is that correct?
Well, science will certainly never figure out why God wants a world.
Well, science doesn't assume there is a God, so that would be...
Right, so science will never figure out why there's a world. Because right now, the scientist feels that the question why is not scientific. Scientists want to deal only with what is, not why it is. Which is fine. Because how are you supposed to figure out why? Why do you love your mother? Do you really need a reason?
Well, there are some things that science figures out or tries to figure out.
Sure, sure. And science has figured out a lot of good stuff. And it will continue to figure out stuff. But in the end, it's going to come to the conclusion that the world was created for a reason. But to find out what that reason is, you're going to have to look in the Torah. So that's where science and Torah come together. Science tells you what happened, the Torah tells you why it happened.
I think a lot of us are getting stuck way before we get to whether there is a God or there isn't a God. I think we're getting stuck in a lot of things that it seems to say in the Torah that it's just, that is opposite of a lot of the fundamental things. Like, do you believe in the theory of evolution? You know what I mean?
You're not supposed to believe in a theory. You're supposed to research a theory. You don't believe it.
There's a lot of things that are proven.
Yeah, it's ultimate form of knowing.
So come ask your question.
They don't need to
Explain
call
yourself.
it theories anymore.
Huh?
They don't need to call evolution theories. It's the whole fact.
So let's narrow it down. For example, the Torah seems to say. One second, Gabriel. The Torah seems to say that on the fifth day, which we're going to learn soon, the fifth day there was created fish and birds. but according to what they found, and carbon dating or whatever else, I don't know whatever other theories they have. First came fish, then came reptiles, then came birds, then the whole order is out of order. So if I'm not mistaken, science has proven certain things that Torah seems to say that is not that case.
Well, let's get something straight. Science does not prove. Science theorizes, particularly when you're talking about something that cannot be reproduced in a laboratory. So this is scientific theory, not scientific fact. The scientist that says this is a fact is being religious. He's turning science into a religion. Science has a theory, and it's a very far-fetched theory because it's something that happened millions of years ago.
Not that it happened, it's still happening.
Still happening. So they can be off, they can be mistaken, they're still working on the theory, and when you start to believe it, you're simply creating a new religion. Like I asked this guy who says he doesn't believe in God, he believes in science. I said, but you're not supposed to believe in science. You're supposed to study science. And besides, I said the theory of evolution has so many inconsistencies and holes. He says with time, they're going to find all the answers. I said, are you sure? He says, absolutely. I said, well, that sounds like a religion. You're absolutely certain that they're going to find answers? That's not scientific. You know, for a long time, Isaac Newton's theory of gravity was considered the fact and the truth. Einstein came along and said, wait, I have a better theory. And it is a better theory. So now we have a completely different definition for gravity. Now, gravity is something that exists right now, and we still can't really pin it down and say for sure this is what it is. So how can we possibly pin it down and say for sure what happened 16 billion years ago? Come on. You have to be very religious and dogmatic to believe that.
3 billion.
How many?
16 billion is before the universe. So that's just
Right, maybe he's saying the beginning of the universe. You know exactly how it happened or what happened.
I'm pretty sure science.
I want to give you a good example. Listen to this story. There was this kid in our city in St. Paul. He was hit by a truck, and he was declared brain dead at the hospital. The father said, well, they wanted to take him off of life support, and the father didn't want him to be taken off of life support. The doctor said, but he's brain dead. And the father said, how do you know? How do you know that his brain is not active anymore? And the doctor said, well, we have this machine that measures brain waves, and it's flat. So the father said to the doctor, how old is this machine? When was it invented? And he told him. So the father said, 10 years from now, will they have a better, more sensitive machine than the one we have now? And the doctor said, yeah, probably. So the father said, so you mean the new machine that they're going to develop will pick up more subtle brain waves that this machine can't pick up? And the doctor said, maybe. So the father said, you're declaring my son dead because you have old-fashioned equipment? So you see, in science, there's always going to be an improvement. There's always going to be new discoveries. When the scientist says the world is 16 billion years old, he's talking like a historian, or he's talking like a religion. He should say, honestly, the world appears 16 billion years aged. How long it's been sitting there, I have no idea. I'm not a historian. That's real science. But what people get into should be called scientism, the belief in science. And that's kind of weird, because it's not religion and it's not science. It's not logical and it's not true. It's just dogmatic. So if you talk to a really honest scientist, he would never say, man evolved from a monkey. That's not even a scientific statement. There is some evidence of an evolutionary process. It's not for sure. And if somebody comes up with a better theory, everybody would be happy with it. So if you're talking scientific, you have to be open-minded, not dogmatic. Otherwise, you're not really a scientist.
But if you're religious, you don't need to be open-minded?
No.
You say confidently that the world was created 5,778 years ago? That also seems silly.
The creator said it.
All right, I guess so. All right.
Yeah. So the way it is today, for most human beings in the world, like 80% of all human beings, if you ask where did the world come from, they will say a creator created it. That's the answer as far as we know so far. Science hasn't replaced that. It has come up with a possible theory. But to say science has proven or science has disproven, it's not correct. Science is a process. If you stop the process and say we have the final answer, then you're no longer a scientist. You're using your faith in a place where you should be using your logic. So, can you imagine the contradiction, the obvious contradiction, when somebody says, you're keeping kosher? But that's ridiculous. These laws were written 3,000 years ago. A lot has changed in 3,000 years. You can't possibly know what happened back then. But then you talk to the scientist and says, you want to know what happened 16 billion years ago? I'll tell you exactly what happened. How is that? We're not sure what happened 3,000 years ago, but we're sure what happened billions of years ago? Come on, that's silly. That's not logical at all. So, if a guy is 45 years old and he's telling you what happened 16 billion years ago, I mean, you got to take it with a little grain of salt. You can't be so religious about it. You can't take it so literally. So, again, is there a conflict? There's no conflict. Science is trying to figure out where the world came from and how and when. So try, figure it out. You have a good theory? That's nice. It doesn't contradict what the Torah says.
So the argument is because the theory can be improved, it can never be perfect. Unlike religion, which so far, or the Torah, has not been improved. Is that your thesis? Am I understanding that correctly?
Their thesis.
I didn't hear you. There can't be a contradiction when somebody says, I put the desk here, and another person says, but it could have gotten here some other way. Yes, it could have. So what's the problem? Where's the contradiction?
My question over, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
Your point is that because the theory can and is constantly improving, that therefore it can't be perfect, unlike the Torah, which has not, and of course apparently does not need to be improved.
I'm sorry, you're not talking into the microphone. It can't be perfect?
Because science keeps improving,
right.
It can't be perfect. So what you're saying is that the Torah is already perfect because it already has what's there and is not improving.
That's right. That's right, that's right. So in the improvement, you can either be going more towards the same conclusion as Torah, or you could be going to some other opposite conclusion. But you got to wait and see. You can't say there's already a conflict when the theory is still in the process. So what is the problem with being a scientist and believing in God? And by the way, most scientists do believe in God. So there really is no conflict. And it is certainly not a logical thing to say, I am not going to practice Jewish law because of science. To serve God, as we've been doing for thousands of years, is not discarded simply because there's a theory.
Yeah, there's a boy here who seems to be struggling very much with a lot of the things that you're saying.
It sounds like the assumption is that the Torah is true when you have to look at both sides and check to see if they're true. But since we're comparing them to one another, you can't just say that science is wrong because the Torah says otherwise. You can also say that Torah is wrong because science says otherwise. We need something else to compare to. Otherwise, this entire argument is pointless because it's stating what's already known.
But I'm not saying what's right. I didn't say Torah was right and science is wrong. Let me try this again. The Torah claims to be the final word. Science does not claim to be the final word. So there's no conflict. Now, if you want to find evidence for the truth of the Torah, that's fine. So you're starting with a conclusion, and you're trying to find some evidence. With science, you're starting with a theory and trying to find evidence for the theory. It's just a different approach. Which one is true? In the end, science is going to discover the truth of the Torah.
Just a correction here. It isn't a theory. It's not a theory. It's a observation. It's what we're seeing and then trying to prove what we see versus the Torah, which is having something that's stated and trying to see what's actually out there and trying to see how that's true.
I think you just contradicted yourself.
No.
Science is, say again, what is science? An observation?
Science is an observation
of what?
Of everything around us. It's an understanding of the universe. It's us trying to understand the world around us. Meanwhile, the Torah is an explanation for the Torah around us. Meanwhile, we're trying to figure out why that's the case.
We're trying to figure out why the Torah is
right and how we can line up our two thoughts up. Trying to line up what we have saying it's true and what's logically concluded.
So what do you mean that science is an observation? Can you explain that a little bit?
Science is us observing the world around us so we can better understand it. It's always improving because our observations are getting better and our knowledge about the universe is also growing with our observations.
Right. Okay. So the observation is you see what is and you're trying to figure out where it came from or how it happened.
Yes.
Okay. And in that process, you will discover more and more to explain the fact after the fact. Once it exists, we're trying to understand what it is. The Torah is telling you why it exists and what it exists for. When these two things come together, then we will have absolute truth. So again, I don't see where there can be a conflict between the two. It's just two directions.
Well, it does say certain things in the Torah and the story of creation that it doesn't seem to line up with what we're observing. With the dinosaur footprints, coming millions of years before any human footprints.
Where's the conflict?
or it seems that they came so many layers earlier when it was the day before.
Yes, but
The whole dating process, again, is based on an assumption. If that assumption is wrong, the whole theory falls apart.
So you're saying the assumption is probably wrong?
Yes. I mean, it's just an assumption. And there's no grounds for that assumption.
I'm sure the science has good grounds for the way they date things, right?
yes, yes.
No, I'm talking about the assumption. The assumption is that it all started in an embryonic state and that it aged at a consistent rate. That's a huge assumption, which other fields of science disagree with. Things didn't age consistently. During the Ice Age, things aged much faster. During the explosion of the Big Bang, it must have aged much faster. So there are a lot of assumptions that if any one of them is wrong, the whole theory falls apart. That's human logic. And you got to be humble enough to admit that human logic can be very flawed. And to say we have proof, we don't have proof. You can prove things only in a laboratory by reproducing the event. You can't prove something in theory.
Say it louder, say it louder.
Okay, the thing here is you cannot prove a theory is what you just said. But the problem is a theory is the highest form of knowing and it only comes about after repeated testing.
Exactly. So what are you testing when it comes to the creation of the universe?
You are.
Right. So if you can't test it, then
There
you...
are actually, it can't be we know the universe began. That isn't a theory. What the theory is how it began. If it was an infinite universe or anything like that. So, you can't. But you can logically conclude, because we're here, there has to be different types. None of them are truly theories, like I said. They're just ideas, they're hypotheses. We all know this. Difference between the theory of the beginning of the universe, because there is none, because we can't ever prove it, not yet at least. Sorry, I literally just want to get myself there, because I have issues.
One question I ask you is, where's the proof that this is the Word of God? Or what's in there is where's the proof that what's in the Torah is what was passed down at Mount Sinai, and that what's at Mount Sinai is what God is trying to express? How do we know that that is the case?
Let's understand something about human logic. The first time an explorer came back from Australia and said that there's an animal down there that hops around on two legs and carries its baby in a pouch on its stomach. If you were there and you heard the explorer say this, and you would say, "Oh, come on, I don't believe that," would you be intelligent or would that be unintelligent?
That would be intelligent.
And what is the intelligence behind that?
The intelligence is, you have to look at it in terms of what people know, because the person, the skeptic, could have just as easily heard the person say it has 3 legs or it has 12 legs. The intelligence is in the question, and the further intelligence would be going there and observing yourself.
Try the opposite. If I don't accept what you're telling me about an animal in Australia, it's not because I'm intelligent. It's because I am suspicious, I'm insecure, I'm afraid to accept what you're telling me because I've been lied to. But logically, I have absolutely no reason to doubt what you're saying.
But you haven't been lied to because no one's told you that there aren't two-legged animals with babies and pouches.
Okay, so logically speaking, if I hear something I've never heard before and I know nothing about it, should I accept it until it's proven false, or should I reject it until it's proven true?
You should reject it until it's proven true.
See, that's not intelligent.
How so?
Because intelligence means always learning something new. If I don't trust anything new, how am I ever going to get out of the caveman stage?
By proving it's true.
No. That is not intelligent. That's insecure. Look,
What?
when in the example of the explorer, if I would say, oh, I don't believe that, you say, why don't you believe that? He said, because I never heard of such a thing. What would the explorer say? You never, of course you never heard of it. I'm the explorer. I went down to Australia to see what's there and come back and tell you what's there. So the fact that you never saw it, that's not an argument. The fact that you never heard of it, that's what explorers are supposed to do. Come back and tell you stuff you never heard before. So where's the problem in logic? It can't be that an animal carries its baby in a pouch? There's a logical reason to say that that's not possible? You see, it's not. It's not. Human intelligence loves new and interesting information without wanting proof. I just want to hear new things. I want to learn new things. So what would an intelligent person say to the explorer? The intelligent person would say, tell me more. Does this animal lay eggs? Does it give birth? Is there a gestation period? Tell me more. It's fascinating. But to say, oh, I don't believe that.
That's what you're saying is,
How do you know?
That's like a 6-year-old saying, I never heard that. Of course, you're 6 years old. Of course you never heard that.
I think the difference is, if somebody was telling you a theory about an animal that has two legs, you would say, I'm not believing it until I see it, until you prove it. But this person is telling you, I saw this the animal. Why shouldn't you believe it? Why is it not intelligent?
And especially if there's a reason for the person to say that's a possibility, then why?
Our class, it's 6:15, so our class is officially over. So I guess...
Okay, let's come to a conclusion, a useful conclusion. There are many things we don't know. Is that true?
Sure. Yeah.
In fact, there's probably infinitely more that we don't know than what we do know. True?
I don't think that's a
There's
fair
a finite
comparison.
amount of objects.
That depends on if there's a finite amount of things to know. I don't reach a conclusion on that anytime soon, so that answer, I don't know for that.
Okay, so logically, if you're an intelligent person, every time you hear something new, you get excited because the mind loves to hear new things. And unless there's a contradiction, you have no reason not to accept it. So let me answer your question. How do we know that the Torah is true, or the Word of God? The Torah says it's the Word of God. Is there a contradiction? Anything in your experience contradict that?
Well, there are many people who say they have the Word of God. So why should I believe that the Torah is?
Maybe they're all true.
But they contradict each other.
If you see a contradiction between two Bibles, now you have a logical reason to say which one is true. But if there's no contradiction, you don't need proof. Say, oh, prove it. You don't have to prove it unless there's a problem.
If two Bibles contradict each other and just say the other one's wrong, how could you decide?
Right. The way to decide, very simply, and this is a factual thing, not a theory, right? The New Testament contradicts the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So now you have to simply say which one came first, and who says that the Old Testament is true, who says that the New Testament is true. Who says the Old Testament is true? An entire people who were there at the event. Who says the New Testament is true? One guy. One guy who says, God said to me, don't do what it says in the Old Testament. So which one are you going to trust? But you see, that's an intelligent conversation because you're dealing with a logical contradiction. Did God say don't kill, or did God say kill everybody in sight? What did he say? But if you just have the Bible and you say, well, how do I know I can trust it? If you have no reason to distrust, then you don't need to prove. In other words, trust is natural, distrust is a learned behavior that comes from bad experiences. So you need a reason to distrust, you don't need a reason to trust. Does that make sense?
No. So then you would...
Like, for example, do you believe in ghosts?
Do I believe in ghosts? No.
You don't think there's such a thing?
Nah.
Huh?
No.
See, on what do you base that?
I base it on that there's no unified theory of what they are, and that they're not, there's no evidence.
But do you realize that we're sitting here talking about ghosts? We're sitting here talking about ghosts. So don't tell me there's no such thing. Tell me what it is. What is a ghost? People have been talking about ghosts for thousands of years. So the intelligent question is, what's a ghost? But to say there's no such thing? How do you know there's no such thing? You can't know that. So as far as I'm concerned, of course there are ghosts. I'm just not sure what it is.
So you don't know anything about ghosts?
Well, we know that they're not physical. They're some kind of a spirit, possibly of someone that once lived. It's fascinating. I can't say there's no such thing. In fact,
Okay, we gotta go. They have their rides are all here.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Appreciate it.
Well, it's night here anyway.
It's almost night here.
Yeah.
Bye bye.